Welcome back, everyone, to the PA the FI Way podcast. I'm your host, Kat, and I'm really excited to have Joel joining us for the episode today. We're going to talk about real estate 101 for busy healthcare providers, talking about buying homes, selling homes, renovating, and investing with confidence. So, welcome to the show, Joel. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you, Kat. I appreciate being here.
Yeah. Before we dive into the questions, let's tell the listeners a little bit about yourself. How long have you been a realtor? What drew you to the profession? What all do you enjoy about being a realtor?
You bet. I have been a realtor here in Minnesota for 32 years. I started when I was 8 years old. So, no, just kidding. I always wanted to be a realtor since I was about a junior in high school. I knew I wanted to be a realtor. And I actually did go to college, got a degree in business finance, and then it did have a focus in real estate in that degree. It was finance, insurance, and real estate. I went to Mankato. Well, it was Mankato State back then, but Minnesota State Mankato, and graduated from there in 1993, got married right after I graduated and started selling real estate right away. So what I like about real estate and what drew me to that profession is I really like people and love hearing people's stories and interacting with people, not a desk kind of person at a cubicle or anything monotonous. My wife would say I have ADHD. So the variety is good for me to, get out and do different things, talk with people. And that's what I like most about real estate is working with people and helping people find their first house or their fifth house, sell their fifth house, whatnot. So, and also the variety that real estate has as far as opportunities in investing in real estate. We've been fortunate enough to purchase some rental properties over the years. And also my wife is an interior designer. So she's super talented. So we've been able to flip some properties as well, renovate stuff and resell. So done a little bit of almost everything, I would say. But just, yeah, I like the variety that real estate offers.
Absolutely. And I'm really looking forward to diving into a little bit more about your real estate investing journey a little bit later in the show. But for context for the listeners, why I invited you on the show is because you were myself and my husband's realtor recently when we sold our house that we had updated over the course of 9 years, and we decided to downsize. We have an upcoming life adventure. And even though you started being a realtor when you were 8, so to speak, you've been a realtor almost as long as I've been alive. So you have tons of experience, Joel, and so excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, it's glad to be here. And you and Brian were great to work with. So yeah, I feel privileged to be here as well.
That's kind. I appreciate you saying that. I know there are ups and downs, so thanks for
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk a little bit about how the listeners could think about how to find the right realtor. Let's talk about what makes a good realtor for them. What are some red flags to look for? But I'm curious, how do you suggest that they vet a good realtor and find one that's a good match for them?
Yeah. You know what? A friend of mine, the loan officer that I work with, he has a really good system that I've kind of stolen his idea. Is a good way to, and this goes almost with any type of profession, whether you're looking for a contractor, even a doctor, or, anything along the line where you kind of are starting from scratch. What he always says is he'll ask different friends or people, even people that aren't necessarily friends, and just say, hey, what do you think of your insurance agent? We'll say. And they, oh, I like them. And then he says, well, what would you rate them on a 1 to 10? And then people, oh, well, I'd give them a 9 or a 6 or, whatever it is. And then if they say 10 or 9, he'll put that like, oh, that's a person I want to talk to. As a loan officer, they're always working with insurance agents, typically on the front line, because premiums affect what people qualify for. So if they can find a good insurance agent that has access to different companies, usually our insurance broker, and they can, hey, we can get your premium down to $300 a month versus 400, that might make the difference of whether they qualify or not. So using referrals from your friends and people you work with, that's always a good, because they like to tell whether their real estate agent was a good experience, and they definitely like to tell if it was a bad experience. So I think getting referrals from people that maybe have had good experiences, and then get a couple, two or three maybe, and then, interview them, see how your personalities match, how adaptable they are to your needs. And one thing is really big is that I've tuned into my clients is I'll typically ask them, how do you like to communicate? Do you like to email, text? Do you prefer phone calls? And then I just adapt to their communication style and needs. Because, you'll have some elderly clients sometimes that do not text, they don't email. Recently, this past year, I've worked with a number of older folks that have been, you know, basically getting out of owning homes, moving into senior apartments, that type of stuff. Basically, phone calls, meeting in person. They like to be face to face. So we drive a lot. We schedule meetings. I go over to their house. We get documents signed. I explain things. Other people, I have some, engineers, they like to seem to email, and doctors, people in the medical field. That's probably a little easier for them a lot of times. And then a lot of people text, too, kind of in that. So just find someone who's adaptable to you. If the agent is like, well, I only email, everything's email, and you don't email, you might miss some things that it's not good, and then, the experience too. Not that someone has to have 32 years of experience to be a good realtor or anything. There's a lot of good agents out there. And I think someone who's just conscientious and ethical is the probably top thing, that they're putting their fiduciary responsibility of their client above their own wants and needs. And someone who's willing to, show houses on a Saturday night, if you're available, then make sure the realtor would be able to do that as well, so I'm sure there's some agents who just try not to work on Saturday evenings. But if that's the only time you're available to look at houses, I know I'm glad to rearrange my plans. And my wife is very understanding. Well, that's all we've known is you got to be a little adaptable.
Yeah, adaptability seems like a really helpful quality to look for. Absolutely. I'm curious, what are some red flags that you kind of caution potential buyers or sellers to watch out for in a realtor?
I think, when you meet someone, usually you can, you know, sniff out, is this person going to work hard for me, or are they going to be, are they just looking for a fast buck and a quick commission, or do they want to, go to the mat, how they treat you as far as like if, I've had some clients that have met with realtors and they said, yeah, that realtor just talked down to me, or they made me, feel like they weren't, they were above listing my, lower price property, and that they were kind of felt like they were wasting their time because all they talked about was the, $1 million listing that they have. And I had a client this summer who she interviewed 3 agents, and the one agent, that's all she talked about was how many big houses she was listing. And her house was a nice house, but priced at 500,000 versus 800,000 or 1.4 million. So she just said it just left a really bad taste in her mouth. But I think, you know, getting those referrals from other people and meeting people in person. And this is a little lighthearted, if someone's rolling up in a $100,000 car, they might have a little financial pressure on them to, charge a little more commission or whatnot. I don't know. That's when I see contractors, that's what I always kind of judge if they're rolling up with brand new equipment, brand new truck, brand new everything. Like, oof, they've got a lot of overhead typically. So, they're probably not going to get the greatest price, from a contractor that has that kind of load and whatnot. So, but that's not to say, that's like I said, more facetious and lighthearted, whatnot. So, but I think someone who communicates with you and like is on your wavelength is probably a um, good measure of if you think that realtor is going to be a good agent for you. Maybe some advice. I mean, I know you guys interviewed a number of realtors, so not
Yeah.
sure what your, criteria was and why you chose me to work with you.
Yeah, I was going to share that when we sold our house this time, this was the first time that we actually decided to interview realtors. We have bought and sold once before, and that process, we didn't really have a realtor set up, and we ended up using the seller's agent also, and he became our realtor because we liked him and those types of things. But we didn't really recognize that it was pretty common to interview realtors and, like you said, feel them out in person and talk through things. And I did honestly use ChatGPT for some guidance of questions to ask and vet and think about what is negotiable, what isn't negotiable, what's common, what isn't common, just things that we don't know because we're not in the field. So there are lots of tools you can use, or like you mentioned, referrals, I think are definitely key. All right. And let's transition into how could a couple or a single person that's a PA or other healthcare professional, how do they know if they're ready to actually buy? Many people in the healthcare industry have six figures of student loan debt, potentially other debt, and they might feel like, oh, I need to buy because I'm young or I'm starting a family. But again, they're drowning in this other debt. So I'm curious, how do you feel like they should think about buying a home when they do have that large amount of debt?
You bet. Well, I think the one thing is talk with a good loan officer and someone who can kind of be transparent with like, hey, this is what payments are, this is where interest rates are, because that a lot of times will affect affordability, obviously. And right now what we're seeing in the market is huge spikes in insurance rates, and taxes have gone up significantly here in Minnesota. So all those things affect affordability. And then where I would think in the medical field, especially, I know some of the pharmacists and doctors and dentists I've worked with, they don't necessarily stay where their first job is long term. So are you going to be moving to the other side of the metro potentially? I think one thing, especially with younger people coming out of medical school or the medical field, are you going to be having kids and cutting back on your hours? I have a friend right now who she's a medical doctor and she's cut back. She's had two kids in the last 3 to 4 years, roughly. I think their oldest is around 3.5. And she doesn't work nearly as much as she did when she didn't have a family. Like, where do you expect to be in 5 years? I have someone I know right now whose husband is a surgical residence right now. And, they bought a house that they could afford now while he's in residency. They have kids and it's, a nice house, but modest. I would assume, that it's where they feel like this is comfortable for us now. And probably not going to be their forever house or anything, I would think. But um, yeah, it's just kind of, I would say you want to be more forward looking and maybe if I'm probably going to be at this position for 2 or 3 years and I can get by just buying a condo or a townhome and not have the maintenance part of it is always something that will alleviate a lot of stress in home ownership. Just because, if you have to mow the lawn, shovel the sidewalk, that takes a few hours a week, that you may or may not have, and especially depending on sleep schedules. A lot of medical people, I would think, have to work some overnight shifts and stuff too. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think just where your comfortability is at with a house payment. Is it cheaper to rent? Maybe. And is it less hassle to rent? Maybe, maybe not. Those are all things. Talk with your loan officer, your realtor, work through those things. I've got a client right now. She's a physical therapist and she got out of physical therapy school and she gave me permission to share this. She had about $80,000 of debt. And in the last 2 years, she's been flipping houses. So we bought and sold houses and she's gotten rid of about 70 some thousand of that debt with two flips. So
Nice.
but she's tired, and she said, I need about a year break before I take on the next one. But we were just out today looking at another potential flips. The last one we closed on probably about 3 or 4 months ago. Yeah, it was about 4 months ago. And she's just renting right now, even though she's owned, and she lived in these properties. So there is some advantages of um, if you're going to do a fixer upper, which maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves on our schedule, but there's advantages of owner occupying those, living those for 2 years and having that tax-free gain from living in a property for 2 years.
Yeah, that makes sense. You touched on a few different points there. One, that renting can fit well for a lot of people, especially if they don't know for sure they're going to live there for years going forward. Residency could be a great point, or PAs will sometimes have fellowships where they might be at a place for a year beyond PA school, and they might choose to rent during that time because they don't know where in the country they're going to end up as well. And renting is often considered to be the top amount that you'll pay per month is the rent, whereas a mortgage is often the base amount you'll pay per month for having a roof over your head. So there's a lot of things to consider. And I think that a lot of people portray the American dream as owning a house, but I think renting can be really great for a lot of people.
It's definitely a viable option. And especially, if you're busy with the hours, that a lot of people in the medical field have, just being able to come home to your apartment or townhome that you're renting and not have to worry about like, do I have to shovel, mow lawn, get snow off the roof, all that kind of stuff is definitely a stress reliever, or just it's not more stuff on your plate that you may or may not want to have. Yeah, it's yeah, I've advised some people I would stay renting with where you're at right now, and you'll know when the time is right to be able to purchase and stuff when you're a little more free time or less stress at the job. That might be when you want to take on a house.
Yeah, and you also touched on how sometimes people decide to cut back on their work hours. And what I always advise people that I talk to or mentor is that you might want to work full time now or even more than full time now, but you don't know what life is going to look like in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whether kids are in the picture or not. So I've cut back on my hours since paying off my student loan debt, and I don't have kids yet, but I really enjoy working a few hours per week and we're able to swing it. So it just lets you to have more breathable room when you set yourself up to be able to have that option in the future.
Yep. I always tell people no one on their deathbed ever said, I wish I would have worked more.
For sure.
Work is an end to a means to an end. It helps with you if you love your job and stuff, but it's not the end all be all. There's a lot more to life than just work and making money for sure.
Yeah. And I'm also curious, a lot of people feel like they need to have 20% down when purchasing a home. Is that actually true, or are there nuances to that or misconceptions with that idea?
No, it's definitely not true that you need 20% down. I've had clients that are veterans and they've put zero down. It's worked out really well for them. They had really good incomes. They had investments in the market where like they were making way more money than, their interest rate. So they said it'd be foolish financially to take money out of their accounts and put it for a down payment. So anywhere from zero, if you're a veteran, you have a zero down possibility. Up to 20% down is where that you basically are able to opt out of mortgage insurance. And it's a kind of a staggered rates. As loan officers will explain to you, if you put 20% down, you won't have any mortgage insurance. If you put 15% down, you'll have X amount, like a smaller amount, versus 10%, your mortgage insurance premium would be a little bit higher, and then 5% or 3.5% with FHA financing. Conventional, typically, in the standard conventional program, 5% down is standard, but there are finance or conventional mortgage programs that you can put as little as 3% down. So a lot of times those are first-time home buyer related finance programs. FHA, you can always put 3.5% down, but you can never get rid of your mortgage insurance with FHA. So that's with it for the life of the loan, no matter how much equity you have in the property, you always will have that mortgage insurance as long as you have that FHA loan. And mortgage insurance premiums fluctuate depending on the housing market. So after the 2008 crash and there was all the foreclosures, after that, we saw mortgage insurance premiums almost double. I want to say, like if typically your mortgage insurance premium was $75, in those years after the crash, the banks were trying to recover from all the foreclosures and losses. Those mortgage insurance premiums went up to $150 a month. And now as the economy's been good the last, 10 years or so, those mortgage insurance premiums are back down to a lower rate. And a lot of times, for every thousand, with current interest rates today, for every $1,000 you put into your down payment, you're only lowering your payment by about $6 a month. So if you put in $10,000, you're saving $60 to $70 a month in payment. Some people, I talk to people depending on the house you're buying. You might want to keep that $10,000 in your savings account because we know that water heater is older. You may be replacing that in the next year or two. Is it worth, where's your comfort level? Would you rather pay an extra $60, $70 and have an extra $10,000 in the bank, for your emergency fund or things that might pop up as you're owning a house? But yeah, it's a good loan officer will be able to kind of explain those numbers.
Sure. And just for clarity for the listeners, you're talking about PMI with that?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Mortgage insurance premium, private mortgage insurance.
We touched a little bit on this next part earlier about affordability and how much house someone should actually buy. But let's dive into that a little bit more. I'm curious if there's a certain percentage of income or DTI, debt to income ratio, that you see is common for people to spend on housing, not only what they could get approved for, what's common that people do, but also what you generally encourage.
Yeah. I know what you qualify for and what you can afford can be two drastically different things. So, as a kind of just a general rule, and everybody's situation is different, I always tell people, you probably want to shoot for about 80% of what you qualify for. Because I think a lot of people are surprised by how much they qualify for. And they look at what the payment would be and they're like, oh, that would not be comfortable. But you qualify for it. So the bank will give you a loan for that amount, but you might not like the payment and stuff. And that's typically people go under what their max qualification is. Oh, and throughout the country, every housing market is different. Like if you get out, Hawaii, for example, extremely expensive real estate. So, that's a totally, different market than Arkansas. Or I was just down in Missouri this fall on a motorcycle trip, and whenever I'm traveling, I always like to look and see what house prices are and stuff. And in the Ozarks, yeah, the house prices and even just across the board, the cost of living was quite a bit cheaper than it is up here in Minnesota. And I have an example, some people that I had worked with a number of years ago, probably 15, 20 years ago, and they were following uh, the advice of Dave Ramsey and only wanted to spend 25% of their income. Only the husband was working at the time, and I don't know that the wife ever planned on working because they were going to start a family. We came across this really nice house opportunity that needed work, but it was a big house. It was just cosmetic stuff, but it was 29% of what their income was, and they totally passed on it. And then I don't know that they ever ended up buying a house because prices just kept going up and up, and probably couldn't keep his income up with that 25%. And I explained to him, I said, that works in Texas because housing was quite a bit cheaper down there. But in Minnesota, we have to build really good quality housing with a lot of insulation because we have 4 seasons. It gets really cold. So housing here is quite a bit more expensive than a lot of other parts of the country just to build because of, our weather and whatnot. So
And we have basements in Minnesota too.
exactly. Yep. That's expensive, pouring those foundations and, cement slab underneath. But typically what I see is people in that 30 to 35% debt to income ratio is seemingly what their housing budget is comfortable for them. Again, if your income is going to be going up quite a bit, maybe you stretch yourselves. I just had a young couple. The wife just finished grad school a couple months ago, and the husband's an engineer, and they're very conservative, which was good. I'm conservative, I'm frugal, so I like that quality. And we were looking at a certain price range, and then one house that they chose was, about 12% more than what the other house prices we were looking at. The house was twice the house of these other houses. I mean, it was bigger, better, and they were really kind of wrestling with it. And I said, normally I don't tell people go to your top of what you're comfortable with, but I said, this is a house you won't be calling me for 15, 20 years to move. I said, if any of these other houses we look at, I said, you're going to be calling me in 3 to 5 years and saying, hey, Joel, we outgrowing this house. We need to move. I said, this house, you will not have to move for a long time just because you can grow in it. And they did see the value in that. And again, she wasn't working yet. So, like in the immediate right now, it was like, oh, it's a little stretch. But in 3 months from now, when she's working, it's not going to be an issue at all. So, that was forward. They were forward thinking versus what's in the right here and now. So, I think they made a really good decision getting that property.
Yeah, there are many factors to consider with all of this. The bigger the house, the more you have to clean and all of that too. And yeah, so it's definitely costly, but moving is a pain. Recently, I've done that with decluttering and getting rid of stuff. And we have temporarily moved into my in-laws' cabin as well, so it's even just a temporary move, but it is a giant pain, and we don't even have kids yet. So
Yeah.
I see all the toys that the kids have with nieces and nephews, and yeah, it's just a giant pain. So there is a lot to be said about not moving frequently, but it all depends upon what your goals are and just being mindful with that too. Some people in the financial independence community do suggest trying to stay under 25% of your monthly gross income as a household for your mortgage. And that's if you don't have lots of other debt. And if you do have a lot of other debt, maybe even closer to 20%. But it depends on the situation and what your goals are too.
And yeah, there's always houses that you can find that debt to income ratio that maybe you want to be in, but it might not be a neighborhood you want to be in. It might not
Sure.
be, you might not feel safe. It's typically, where there's higher crime rates, housing tends to be cheaper. And
Yeah.
hey, you can buy a house, but it's going to be here. And that's not always comfort. So that can be something where, hey, it's worth going outside our formula to be in a neighborhood where we feel good or safe or
Mhm.
whatnot.
Yeah, and even commuting can play a role too. Like I know that I absolutely dislike commuting and I feel like I'm wasting my time when I'm commuting. Other people might not mind commuting to work or to visit family nearby. So location can play a huge role for lots of factors for
Oh, for
people too.
sure.
So there's so many interesting nuances to consider and it's really important that you have someone to guide you through that process and talk through that process as well. Like you said, talking to lenders too. But the bottom line is very likely don't stretch yourself and get the highest mortgage you can get because you'll feel that and you'll feel that pressure for many years to come.
Yeah, there's a kind of a acronym we call the SWAN factor, and where you sleep well at night. Like, will you
Sure.
sleep well at night with this mortgage payment? And that's what some people get hung up on price of a house, where I always tell them, look at your payment.
Yeah.
It's equates to, as if a couple's looking at their wedding and only focusing on their wedding. Like, no, you look at the marriage and like the long term, that's because you live with the payment every month. So if the payment is comfortable, and, because terms are everything, if the interest rates are lower, that makes a house that maybe is more expensive than what you want more affordable, that's going to be totally different because yeah, you live with the payment. So that's what you want to focus on and make sure that's comfortable in your household budget and what your future plans are. And sometimes even like, hey, we know we're going to have to buy another car because the car we're driving now is got 300,000 miles on it. So maybe you don't want to spend as much on a house knowing you're going to may have a car payment.
Yes, lots of factors to consider. And I'm a firm believer that there's phases of your life too. So if you're a brand new grad, maybe you're still single and you have lots of student loan debt, it's very reasonable not to buy. It's reasonable to rent. Or if you do choose to buy a smaller home and know that that might not be your home in 5 or 10 years.
I always talk about and my wife and I did this, we used our homes that we lived in as stepping stones, because typically your first house isn't going to be your dream house, So, and my daughter has done this. She would our first place that we bought was a one bedroom condo, and then we lived there for about a year, and then we ended up buying a twin home with my wife's grandparents. We each bought a side of the same building, and then we were kind of taking care of helping with grandma and grandpa, bring them to doctor's appointments. I did all the lawn care, shoveling, so they wanted to remain independent. They didn't want to move into senior apartments yet.
Sure.
And then, so we lived in a twin home for a couple years. And then once grandma and grandpa moved into their senior apartment, we bought a single family home, our first true single family home. And it was a fixer upper, as the twin home was too. We fixed all these up and then lived there for 2 years, bought a bigger house because we were our first 10 years of marriage, we moved 5 times and we had 5 kids. So we were moving, having a baby, moving, having a baby, that kind of thing. So that was, I look back at that now and I mean, we were young, we were in our 20s. So you had a lot of energy. That's the thing, your energy level dictates a lot of what you feel you can do or are capable of. But, we just used those houses as stepping stones, and our mortgage payment really didn't change a whole lot to the house we're in now that we've been in for 24 years. I want to 23 or 24 years. But our payment from the twin home, I mean, it was kind of almost, just within a few $100s up until we got the house we're in now. Other than taxes and insurance going up, those factors, but the mortgage part didn't change a lot. So, but
That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing.
yeah, I wouldn't recommend it to everybody, but we were in that. I mean, we're in the field. My wife's a designer, so like I said, it fit really good for us. Not that everybody can do that or should do that. It was it's very nice. So we love our house we're in now.
Awesome. Let's transition to talk a little bit about buying a home. What are some common mistakes, but also what are some smart moves that people can make?
Yeah, I think getting connected with a good realtor that you feel comfortable working with is probably what people typically do first. And that's always a good, I like that when people, like, hey, let's find a realtor, let's get our questions answered. A lot of times as an agent, I have the loan officers that I recommend and work with, had really good experiences with. Real estate is kind of a team effort. You've got the realtor, the loan officer, title work, home inspectors, contractors that all come into play a lot of times. Because if you do a home inspection, a good home inspector is going to find a lot of stuff with the house, and then maybe you need a contract like, hey, we need a plumber and electrician to come and look at this a little further. And if you have a agent who has all those connections, that's super helpful. As I've been in this business, for 32 years, I've got my list of people that I know I can recommend and they do a good job and they're honest. I always tell people, the home inspector that I recommend, I always tell people, yeah, he probably blows 4 or 5 deals a year for me. But I like that because he finds things that will reveal themselves where the buyer is not comfortable with, I don't want to deal with that, or that's too much of a concern.
Yeah.
And knowing that you can get out of the transaction, and I'm fine with it. I don't mind it. I know you always hear stories about agents telling the home, at least this is what home inspectors have told me over the years, where agents get mad at them.
Hmm.
For you're blowing this deal because you're finding too many things wrong with the house, and that's part of real estate. There's no perfect house out there. Just knowing how to deal with the things that come up is helpful, or having knowledge of that, or the people that have knowledge of it, if you can recommend someone, so. But yeah, working with an agent that has those good people surrounding them. If your agent says, oh, I don't really know any plumbers, or I don't know electricians, that might be a little concerning that they don't have anyone to recommend to kind of get over those hurdles or get good opinions on those items. So that's how I've always got my list of people. And I have people call me years after they've bought their house, and then they need a plumber, and they'll, Joel,
Yeah.
can you give me a plumber? And, I'll give them a couple different names of people and whatnot.
Yeah. I have learned that realtors are one of the most connected people in your network that you can know. So even if you're trying to find a professional of all sorts, it's a reasonable task. A trusted realtor for a referral.
You bet.
Joel, what are some first time buyers' mistakes that they commonly forget to budget for? Where do you see where they feel like they should have actually had some money set aside for these things, but they forgot to?
So I was just talking with a client this week about, we're considering new construction. We're looking at existing houses and then talked about new construction. So, like a common one for new construction is, and this seems silly, but there's never window treatments in new construction. So, like you'll close on the house and then all of a sudden, oh, I'm living in a fishbowl. And then you got to buy blinds and curtains. And I don't think people realize how expensive decent blinds and curtains cost, because you'll spend $4,000 to $5,000 more on blinds and curtains. Kind of funny, but it's something that you got to kind of think about and know that, like, oh, I'm gonna have to put that on a credit card because I just put all my money in my down payment and whatnot. But I think looking at the mechanicals is always, again, forward thinking. How old is that furnace? If it's 20 years old, but it's running fine, but you'll want to know that, hey, in the next 5 to 7 years tops, probably going to be replacing that furnace. Same with water heaters, air conditioners, appliances. Those are all things to kind of consider when you're making your offer. And sometimes, like, what we'll do is ask, depending on the market and the situation and the interest level, if there's multiple offers, you can't always ask for seller paid closing costs. But sometimes we'll have people ask for $5,000 of seller paid closing costs because that furnace is really old, or the inspection revealed that, yeah, it's getting there. Sometimes these older appliances and mechanicals are hard to get parts for to repair them. And so there's always a kind of a point where it's just cheaper and better to replace it than trying to keep fixing stuff too. So
Yeah.
a house, it's kind of, I always use the analogy, houses are like kids. You always need to feed them to keep them growing and keep them healthy, or just like us, you always got to feed the house, with repairs, maintenance, whatnot. So,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
yeah, big ticket items, even the roof, windows, and not everything. And I know that's on our probably topics to talk about, is not everything gets a rate of return. Like if you like furnaces and air conditioners, you may spend $5,000 to $10,000 installing a new furnace. No buyer is going to pay you $5,000 more because it has a new furnace. They're concerned, does it have a working furnace?
Yeah.
So it's a good analogy another realtor used was, he goes, if you're selling a car and you have a flat tire and you get the tire replaced, no one's going to, hey, I just put a brand new tire on that car. You're going to pay $300 more for the car. And it's like, no, it's got 4 tires that should be inflated. So mechanicals are kind of the same way, but those are the big things to look at, I think. The other thing is, I know sometimes people that watch too much HGTV will have this ideal of what a house will be like and should be like. And again, that's TV, not necessarily reality. Just kind of, I always like to ask my clients, and I'll give them my opinion, as we're starting looking, what would you rate this house on a 1 to 10? Just like, as you're looking for a contract or a referral. I always like to use the number system, and I'll let them go first. And they're like, I'd give this house a 6. And I'm like, well, actually in this price range, this is an 8, but they might have different expectations. And I'll go over why I think that, and, try to get a sense of the market. And I always tell my buyers that you'll be an expert in your price range and area that you're looking at, by within months of, once you look at 5 to 10 houses, that market better than
Sure.
your parents are going to know it, better than anybody else other than other people looking in that market. So you got to trust. I think a lot of times you just have to trust your instincts. And after looking at, that average buyer looks at about 10 to 12 houses before they write an offer. So I've had some people write an offer sight unseen on a house. They already knew the house. It was their neighbor's house when they were growing up, They're like, oh, I know that house. I want to buy it. And they were out of town, weren't able to go look at it, but wanted to get an offer in. And so And then I've shown some clients, which I don't keep track, but I have some clients that have kept track of how many houses I've showed them. And I had one client tell me that I showed him 76 houses. I was kind of like, oh, so it's anywhere in between 0 to 80, we'll say.
There you go.
But tip average, once you've looked at 10 to 12 houses, what's a good deal and what's not, and can find something that's going to work for you.
Yeah, I do find it really interesting how a lot of your job actually has to do with psychology and managing expectations and having good interpersonal communication and skills too, because like you said, people can have their dreams and their vision, and sometimes you have to bring them down to reality in a kind and respectful and professional way.
You bet. You bet. Yeah. It is, you want, and I would say one other, going back to an agent, someone who's fairly calm, level headed, because there's a lot of ups and downs in the real estate transaction. You'll feel insulted by offers you receive from buyers as a seller, and uh, respond, emotions can get high and low, and you want to just try to keep even. And I think that's one thing I've had clients indicate in the past that, oh, through all this, you've just been really calm. And that's what you want. You don't want your realtor getting all excited and getting mad. And, that doesn't really serve your clients in the end. If you're offending the other parties, it's definitely helpful to have someone who's level-headed and calm.
Yeah, that really makes sense for sure. With the buyers, do you ever feel like there's a good time that they might actually make it a good decision to waive inspection? Or do you feel as though having an inspection is always important?
I sometimes, if there is, like I'll use your house as an example. You guys
Sure.
had a beautiful house. You had just redone everything. Your mechanicals were newer. The septic system was newer, And if there had been multiple offers, coming in, and I was representing a buyer for your house, I would say, hey, you may want to consider waiving the inspection to give yourself an advantage. We know the furnace is only a year old, everything's brand new. Not that things can't go wrong or if something wasn't installed right or whatnot, but on the face of it, is it worth the risk versus reward? The risk is pretty minimal when you have newer mechanical items, or you can tell a house has been well taken care of. And the reward of getting that property is, up here versus the risk being down here. So I do it once in a while. And depending on the person's how comfortable they are with repairs. One of my clients, we were in multiple offers. The house, you could tell there was some, it was an older electrical panel, and there were, some things, but my client's dad was an electrical engineer. He's like, oh, and dad came and looked. He goes, oh yeah, that's no problem. We can replace that panel. And the husband was an engineer as well. So they were very comfortable with home repairs. They had done them before on their own house when he was growing up and stuff. So it's just how comfortable are you with that? And I always try to point out, like, these are the things that can be an issue. Let's go to worst case scenario. Like, what if you had to replace the furnace? Would you not want this house if you did have to replace the furnace in a year? Well, no, we'd still want the house. I'm like, okay. So anything that the furnace is, it's going to work for 2 more, 3 more, 5 more years, that's all bonus because you were okay with it, not. So you just have to work through those scenarios. And that's, yeah, just, I guess it does boil down to people's comfortableness with the property. And there are some properties I would just say I would not buy this house unless you had an inspection too.
Sure.
Every house is different. So we always recommend inspections. And then sometimes you can still have an inspection, but not make the purchase contingent on that inspection. So you can still get the knowledge of, like, okay, these are the things that, we might need addressing. It's worth the, $600 to have a home inspection, just to have that list of things, just budget for them in the future. So that's always an option as well.
Yeah, definitely. Next, let's talk about selling a home and what the seller should consider with this process. What do you feel as though sellers should do and should not do before listing a home?
I think, you should interview a realtor and then get recommendations like what would be worth spending money on, because there's always, it's kind of like a graduation party. Everybody gets their house fixed up for the grad party typically, and then don't necessarily do anything until the next grad party. So there are some things that are worth doing, typically surfaces, your walls, flooring, those you usually get a good rate of return on those. So if you have outdated or, your paint needs freshening up and stuff, it probably is worth doing that painting, flooring as well. I know the number we always used to say, typically whatever you would spend on flooring and painting, you would double your resale and your value. So if you spent $4,000 carpet and flooring, you'd add about $8,000 of value to the house versus having the old worn out flooring. So those things are good. Kitchens and bathrooms, obviously, those are always what people are looking at the most. I always say about 95 to 90% of the time, if it's a couple purchasing a home, the wife or the female in the decision making has about 90% of the say. Not always, but typically, because the guys, I always joke that, guys just look at the garage. How big's the garage? Does it have a bathroom? Yeah, okay, whatever she wants, because it's a home, it's, if you want to be stereotypical, the females make it a home. The guy's been in enough bachelor houses where, it's a woman's touch is really nice to have. So they typically have a better eye for that kind of stuff. So kitchens will appeal to that. If it's got a nice kitchen where it feels like, hey, we could have some nice family time in the kitchen or around the kitchen for if people entertain a lot, that kind of stuff. And that's, again, being stereotypical, but it's pretty accurate. A few times, or the 5% of the time where the male in the relationship is typically an engineer, an attorney, or a doctor, like someone who's more of a type A that has specific wants and whatnot. 95%. And I think if you talk to any realtor, they would probably tell you the same thing as how it shakes out.
Yeah, I can imagine that there's lots of conversations that happen between couples when they're trying to buy places and lots of negotiation between each other too.
Yeah, I've had some clients where all the husband wanted was a 3-car garage. He didn't care what the house was like as long as he had a 3-car garage. That's what mattered to him. And then he was agreeable to any style, anything. He was going to be out in the garage, a lot. So, but
That's funny. Curious to hear your thoughts on if the seller should stage the home, or do you feel like staging isn't necessary?
I think it is helpful to have some staging done. You don't have to go all out all the time. My wife does my staging for me. A lot of times she can do anything from work with what you have. And a lot of times she'll just rearrange furniture, or will most of the time take furniture out. A lot of people will have too much furniture, and you want the spaces to flow and look bigger and not crowded. That's my wife's talent. So she'll go in and say, hey, let's rearrange this stuff, orient this group of furniture towards the fireplace, which they maybe had it set up to watch TV, and like everything's facing away from the fireplace. But if you orient the furniture and take the TV out of that room, there's all kinds of different things that she does. And then she has staging stuff where she'll bring in pictures, plants, all kinds of decorations. And then sometimes, like if a house is empty, she has a furniture rental place that rent furniture, and they deliver it, and it just make the house look very updated and nice. If people's, we're very tactful about like, oh, that yellow chair isn't quite what we're trying to accomplish, or it clashes with the furniture or the cabinets in the kitchen. Staging is definitely helpful because people can picture themselves like, oh, this looks so nice, and I can picture myself being here, versus if they have really outdated stuff or stuff doesn't match, people are just looking at everything around them and picking out what they don't like. Like, oh, I don't like that. I don't, so it's kind of a mindset too,
Yeah.
where you want to have it as neutral or appeal. I don't want to say neutral, but just appealing to the broadest cross section of potential buyers that you can. So having staging is definitely so. Now I know when we did your house, I said you guys don't need to do your house is very tasteful, beautiful. You didn't need any staging done there. And you run into that too. Some houses, yeah, they're fine.
Yeah, it was funny. My husband Brian and I, we thought that we would have some staging, and both you as well as other realtors we talked to, they're like, "No, you don't need staging." And we're like, "Okay, sure."
Yep.
It was funny.
Yep. That's good.
It sounds though like the sellers should try to minimize distractions, basically, not have anything super loud, over the top, super
Cluttered.
weird or unique that is leaving more questions than answers for people walking through.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of times it's even just clearing off all the magnets on the refrigerator, clearing surfaces
Sure.
is huge. That's all staging, removing stuff. A lot of people I think staging is like, oh, I got to add furniture and add this and that. But a lot of times it's, addition by subtraction, like putting a lot of stuff away. And I always tell people, you can start packing now because you're going to be moving anyways. So let's get rid of all this clutter, put it in totes and bins and put it out in the garage or in closets because that really doesn't matter when you're selling the house. If you have bins filled, the garage is full of bins or whatever, or furniture, that won't matter, in the sale of a house.
Yeah, and it's a long process to go through all that stuff. So start as soon as you can.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, get a head start on it for sure.
So when people are selling their homes, they often are trying to think about how could they maximize their profit, right? Both with the listing price, but also with commissions, fees, closing costs, all of the things that play into this picture. So I'm curious to hear what are some general guidelines you have for potential sellers listening to this and that could help them. I'm sure it depends on their situation and their goals and things like that, but what would you suggest?
And every market is different. Advice I would have given 3 or 4 years ago will be different than in today's market. During the COVID years, there was this huge demand for housing. Interest rates were 3-4%. Everything you put up on the market typically had multiple offers. So you couldn't really, if you were just in the ballpark price range, it was selling, and typically multiple offers. In this market that we're in currently, I'm saying it's a balanced market. It's not a seller's market anymore. It's not a buyer's market either. So pricing is really important. And you can typically get more sometimes by asking a little bit less. So if you get your market analysis done and get like, okay, this is what 2 or 3 different realtors have said our house is worth, and then you can price it right at that. The temptation is always like, well, I'd like to try to get 20,000 more. And buyers are just as smart as sellers because they see all the houses, what they sell for in pictures and everything. So if you overprice, typically you're going to be sitting on the market longer. And then by the time you reduce your price to where it maybe should be, the market there's fatigue with days on the market. So people like, well, yeah, it seems like it's priced right now, but boy, it's been for sale for 60 days. What's wrong with it? There's a stigma to a house sitting on the market for a longer period of time. What has worked really well this last year is, find that price and let's just say it's a house worth $500,000. And if you price that house at 489.9, 10,000 less, typically people will see buyers are smart. They're like, oh, this one's priced really well. Then you end up sometimes more often than not getting multiple offers on a house by just pricing it, 1 to 2, 3% lower than what the market price is. It sometimes will drive that 1 to 2%, 3% higher than what the market, because it creates this frenzy. You'll get more traffic through the house with that just a little bit under what the market is. So those are all strategies. It's always scary to price. Why should I price it lower? What if I only get an offer? And I'll give an example. I had some clients that retired. They were moving up north. So ended up getting them a house up, in the Motley area, found a house there, but it was going to be contingent on the sale of their house here in the metro. And I said, well, this is what your house probably will sell for. Here's 3 other houses very similar to yours. And I said, but we're going into the fall. I said, it's going to start slowing down a little bit. I said, I would recommend we price it, I think I said 10,000 less. And then I said, well, I almost guarantee we'll get multiple offers on this. They're like, oh, I don't know. They had to pray about it. And then they just said, no, Joel, we'll trust you. But then they gave me but if we don't get this amount, we're not going to sell, or whatever. Anyways, they ended up getting way more. We ended up getting way more for their house than what I even anticipated, just because it was at that sweet spot where it just created a ton of interest, and we had 3 or 4 offers, and it worked out great. So, but that's you got to be comfortable if for some reason the market, in the wintertime or fall market does slow down typically, you can't always guarantee you're going to get multiple offers or whatnot. But so
Sure.
you bet. And I always, the one thing too is typically you can't underprice a house, because if it is priced below market, buyers recognize that, and then they want in on that good deal. So you can definitely overprice a house though. So, but typically in our market, you can't underprice a house. So
That's great. And both for sellers, but also buyers, curious to hear what your thoughts are for the people who consider not working with a realtor and trying to sell their home for sale by owner, or even potentially buy a home. What are your thoughts with that? I recognize maybe you're a little biased being a realtor, working in the profession, but what thoughts do you have with that?
no, it's um, buying a home without a realtor is probably, you're always, if you're looking at other houses that are on the market, you're going to be working with a realtor. So I would always recommend you be represented when you're buying a house. I've helped, I think just this year, I want to say I helped 2 of my past clients that were for sale by owners. They had the one, he just wanted to try putting it on Facebook. They were moving out of state. So he said, well, we're going to list it with you in May, but I'm just going to put it on Facebook. And I said, well, that's totally fine. I said, I'll help you with the transaction. And I'm glad to help with for sale by owners. And it's called facilitating a transaction. So I helped my seller make sure he had all the disclosures properly filled out that he needed to legally sell his house and not get in trouble. So I helped him with the disclosures, made sure he had his well and septic information, had to get his septic tested and certified. And then he put it out on Facebook Marketplace, had 5 or 6 people, a lot of disappointment because people would make appointments, not show up. He was starting to get frustrated. And then finally had a really nice young family came to look at it. And I worked with them. We got the transaction together. Worked out really good for everybody. And then at another transaction, same thing, where I think it was a relative was purchasing grandma's house or something, and they just needed someone to facilitate it. So, but when you're purchasing, you're going to be working with a realtor. If you're working with a seller's realtor, maybe that's not necessarily what you want, because they are, even though there is a dual agency where they're supposed to be neutral, it's always good to have your own advocate in that process. And typically the seller will pay the buyer broker commission. It's all negotiable. That stuff has all kind of changed in this last year on how that's structured. But the majority of the time, the seller will pay the buyer broker's commission. So it's minimal cost to the buyer. There may be a transaction commission that each broker charges per transaction, but you don't want to say that working with a realtor is free, because there's always cost involved. So, but yeah, for sale by owners, you don't get the exposure necessarily that, you're not exposing it to the whole market. So you never necessarily know what other people would be willing to pay for your house if it was listed. But if you don't want, you know, crowds of people coming through, that for sale by owner is an option. But it's not no work. There's work to selling your house, and then there is some exposure to from a legal standpoint. So I think I would always recommend you have some professional kind of guiding you in
Yeah,
what you're doing. So
that makes sense. And like you said, there's a lot of underlying value too. It might not be super apparent on the surface, but as you get further into the process, you can understand that it's nice to have a guide when situations pop up, and all those types of things. And to follow up on you saying everything's negotiable or things are negotiable, could you clarify that for the listeners, for the sellers working with their agent, is it common to negotiate commissions or fees, or is it where you find some that say, nope, this is what it is, this is standard, this is what I always do?
Yeah, every brokerage and probably every realtor is different. Our the company I'm at, we're an agent-owned company, so we're a little bit different than your traditional broker. So the agents, I'm at Counselor Realty, and we are agents. We have agents that are shareholders, so we vote on
Okay.
company policy, and we're very independent. So we can kind of look at our business and say, hey, I can charge less because I have less overhead. Some brokerages, it's all negotiable, but some brokerages may have a policy where, like, nope, we charge, 3% for a listing side or 3.5% or whatever it is. It just depends on each individual brokerage. So, and some agents will, like, oh, yeah, I can go down to this. And some agents will draw a firm line and say, nope, for it to be worth my while, I have to get this amount. So it is negotiable, and you can just ask your brokerage, is what can you do? What's the best you can do?
Mm-hmm.
Is a good way to probably phrase it.
Yeah.
And then it's a little different. I think if people haven't bought or sold a house in the last, or sold a house, and the way of selling a house is, you would list it. The listing company would charge X amount commission. And I'll just use this round number of 6%. And then out of that 6%, they would pay out to a buyer broker, 3% or 2.7% of that. And then, so the seller always knew exactly, like, okay, I know I'm going to have to pay 6%, and the buyer broker is taken care of. There was a class action lawsuit that was settled last year with the National Association of Realtors, where they felt you're forcing sellers to pay buyer brokers, which maybe they don't need to or want to. So now what we've gone under the model of, there's a listing percentage, and then the buyer percentage is negotiable. And you can, just work that out at the time of the offer, or you can still do it the traditional way of, like, hey, I'm going to pay my listing broker X percent, and then they're going to they agree to pay out to a buyer broker. So the way we get, or I'll just speak for myself, the way I do it is just, I only address the listing side, and then we wait and see what the buyer broker asks for, and it's negotiable at the time of the purchase agreement. I just had a situation where we had 8 offers on my listing, and some of the brokers, said they wanted 3%, and some wanted as low as 2.5%. And we kind of use that as a negotiation, where my seller just said, this other offer, where they were both pretty close, that they're only asking for 2.5%. Would you, as the buyer broker, be willing to take that 2.5% to kind of bridge that gap? And they were willing to do it because they wanted their client to get the house and whatnot. So it is negotiable. So it's it's up in the air, but the idea is that they're hoping it'll bring commission costs down.
I appreciate you touching on that because it was all over the news, but it was still confusing to decipher for those of us outside of the real estate world.
I'm a bottom line, big picture type of thinker. So that's kind of the bottom line, is both sides. The buyer side is separate from the listing side.
Yeah, very cool. Well, let's touch a little bit further about your real estate investing journey, if you don't mind. We don't have to go super deep into the weeds, but could you share what sparked your interest with real estate investing and just kind of your overview of your journey so far?
I know, when you're selling real estate, you see rental properties, you sell some duplexes. And then, it got me thinking, like, oh, that'd be kind of nice to own some rental properties, have a little supplemental income. My wife, she always wanted a cabin because she grew up with her grandparents, going to her grandparents' cabin. And when we were relatively young, again, probably 24 years ago, we had an opportunity to buy a lake cabin at a very good price. But I said, well, if we're going to have this expense of a lake cabin, we need to have an income property. So we were able to buy a duplex and a cabin the same summer. So not that the duplex paid for the cabin payment, or well, yeah, it didn't necessarily pay for it, but it offset it quite a bit, you know. So that's how we started with the rental property. We bought a duplex and then bought some other single family homes over the years. And then we did flip some houses back in the early 2000s. So we've kind of done a little bit of everything. And it's a lot of work. You know, there's even rental properties, it's called passive income, but it is a part time. I always just tell people it's a part time job and it's not a get rich quick. Rental properties aren't a get rich quick proposition. It's a get rich slow. You know, you make your money off of the tenants paying the mortgage down. And then when the property's paid for, you got a nice asset there and then probably a lot better cash flow. But I was just talking with my physical therapist client because she's looking at, I don't know if I should do long-term rentals or maybe some Airbnbs or something of that nature. And I said, well, long-term rental, like even if you're cash flowing, eventually you got to replace the roof, replace furnaces, you know, there's major expenses that come along every 15, 20 years. So I know with our duplex, whatever I was cash flowing, I had in a 2 year period, I had to replace the roof, replace 2 furnaces and 2 water heaters, all in a 2 year period. So I kind of calculated like, oh man, all that money that I cash flowed for the last 12 years, I spent it all in 2 years, you know. So you just have to have that, you know, you don't spend everything you're making. You got to sock it away for those expenses that come up and whatnot. So,
Yeah, emergency funds for your properties too, right?
yep, you got to have that. So, and even in today's market, the long term rental is a lot tougher than it was back when we bought ours, just because taxes and insurance are much more expensive now. So,
Yeah. So, with the different types of real estate investing, like long term rentals, like you touched on, short term rentals like Airbnbs, or mid-term rentals, which are usually 30 days or so plus, maybe for people like travel nurses or travel PAs and things like that. Are there any of those types that you think are more realistic for busy healthcare providers to consider starting to real estate invest?
yeah, I would, you know, the long-term rentals are probably the least invasive or like I don't want to say least, probably the least amount of work, you know, because if you get someone in, like I've had tenants in my units. One tenant's been there probably 12, 13 years, really good tenant. Another one's been probably 10 years, and then another one's probably going on their third year. So that's a little easier, you know, and I get calls occasionally like, hey, the toilet's clogged or whatever, you know, and you just have to deal with that kind of stuff. The short-term rentals, the Airbnbs are very labor intensive because if you're turning something over every week, you've got to get the cleaning, the laundry, you've got to have all those services lined up. And then what if your cleaning crew is sick or not available? Then what? Do you have a backup cleaning crew available or do you have to drive over there or up north, wherever it is, you know? So there is a lot of work to the Airbnb stuff. I like the midterm rentals. I've got a friend of mine and she's a nurse herself, but she has a townhome with a big, beautiful basement. And she built out a kitchen and she does traveling nurses rental. And that's worked out really well for her. She does very well with that. That one, I like that because you know, it's a little more stable as far as people are there 30 to 90 days typically, or whatever a contract. Sometimes contracts, I've seen them as long as 6 months and then, or they've renewed, maybe it's 3 months and then they renew another 3 months, but you know, they're employed. You know, that's always, they don't have really a risk of losing their job, make decent money, you know, which is always nice. So I like that model if you can have the right situation for it. That seems like you know, you have to furnish the place. So, you know, and you could probably, depending on the city requirements, maybe you can do some short-term rentals too, if they allow it. You know, you could maybe, if you have okay, I'm not going to get another person in here for 2 months. I'm going to do some short-term rental over some weekends. You know, you might have some flexibility with that too.
Yeah, definitely lots of things to consider. And like you said, they can take up a lot more time than what people initially think. They aren't truly passive, but they can have lots of benefits to And some people consider using property managers, but then they'll eat up some of your income and it can be hard to find a good property manager. So it sounds like you probably use your network and your team of contractors and professionals that you know and do the call yourself versus working with a property manager.
And I've referred property managers to different clients, and some of them, like the property managers started out really well. And then 3 years later, they're super dissatisfied with the property management. So it's probably something that you always have to keep on top of, and nobody's going to care more about your property than yourself. So even a good property management company, there's always going to be gaps probably and holes in service that maybe you're expecting.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I really appreciate your time and your insight and all of the information that you shared. I'm curious, do you feel as though you have any last top pieces of advice for someone buying or selling in the next year or anything else that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Guess just find a good team that you're going to work with, and trust their advice. And to obviously you can vet. There's so many good tools out there to be able to vet things, but I think you'll kind of know the property. That's what people always like, oh, how will I know which house to buy, or condo, or townhome? And like I said, I think just getting out there and looking at stuff. I just showed a house this weekend to a client that they're in a lease until October, but they want to just kind of start getting an idea of what's out there now versus, we'll probably start hitting it harder in the summertime. So I'm I'm always available to my clients to look at anything anytime they want. They felt bad that they asked me to do it on a Saturday at 3 o'clock. I'm like, no, I work weekends and nights, so that's normal, and that's, you just want to make sure you find an agent that's really going to work for you and be flexible. And there's a lot of good agents out there. I would say there's, the majority of agents are good. There's always, in any industry, you probably in your industry, there's always a few clunkers out there that, they've lost their passion or whatnot for it. But I think just finding someone good that you're comfortable working with, and that's going to work hard for you too. So, and even has support. Like, I've got, we have a team of agents that we all help each other out. I've got a partner that if she's out of town, I cover for her. If I am gone for a weekend or something and someone needs to see a house, I've got 3 or 4 agents that can tap to, like, hey, can you show this house on Saturday? I'm going to be gone, or I've got a funeral to go to. Having that support team around you too as an agent is important, so your clients don't miss anything.
That's awesome. Could you share if any of the listeners are interested in connecting with you, reaching out to you, asking questions, or potentially using you as the realtor? Where could they find you? What information would you like to share?
Yeah, I can. Probably the easiest way is my mobile number, either text or call. I typically always get my text messages. I don't always get to answer the phone if I'm with a client. I don't like to answer my phone, like to try to give their undivided attention. And then my voicemail, I just leave full because I get so many spam calls. It fills up right away. So just texting is the best. And my number is really easy. It's 651 303 5050. So 651 303 5050. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me. And then I can share email and stuff once we talk or whatnot if anybody does want to talk.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thanks again, Joel. I really appreciate it. And you have been so thoughtful and helpful with your time and expertise. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Kat. I enjoyed it. Thank you.